When you think about expensive collecting for a system, automatically you probably think of one thing, the NES. The NES is very expensive to collect for right now, with games skyrocketing in price. There's games in the thousands of dollar range now, and it's getting pretty insane. Some people are actually not wanting to collect NES games anymore, and NES collecting has kind of died down a little bit because of these high prices, but there are still tons of people going out there and buying these games for high prices. I thought to myself though, is the NES really the most expensive mainstream system to collect for? And within my research I find out that no, it's not. There's actually another mainstream system that's not only more expensive to collect for, but in my opinion, it's harder to collect for as well. What system is that? It's the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn is skyrocketing in price and has become extremely expensive to collect for nowadays. I'm going to show you a quick graph right here that shows you that Sega Saturn sales average about $30 per game. Now versus the NES is only averaging about $20. So why is Sega Saturn collecting so expensive right now? In this video I'm going to talk about why I feel this is the case. So the first reason I feel that Sega Saturn collecting is so expensive right now is just because when you look at the system sales of the actual console. Whereas the NES was hugely successful in North America, the Sega Saturn only sold about 1.5 to 3 million lifetime units in North America. That is not a lot of systems. So what does that mean for the games? Well, of course, developers and publishers are not going to create as many copies of games for the system if there's a much smaller install base, especially when you compare it to the PlayStation 1, which had over 11 million, which was also a CD-based system. That's why a lot of games either didn't come to the Saturn or were late ports because of the huge gap in system sales. So the common games that you get for any system are actually rare on the Sega Saturn because nobody was making games. They were creating games, sure, but as far as releasing games, nobody was really doing that with the Sega Saturn. So that really put it in a pigeonhole, and that's why there's not a lot of copies of games out there for the Sega Saturn to collect now. The second reason it's pretty tough to collect Sega Saturn games right now is because of how you have to actually buy the games. Now hear me out on this. With the NES, you can have a beautiful library of just cartridges. There's nice end labels, and it's easy to display and store them. Same thing with the Super Nintendo, any cartridge-based system. With discs though, it's much harder to store them, and you can make custom cases for your discs, but most people want a complete in-box copy, or at least a box copy of the game. So now you're at another catch-22. Do you pick up just the disc and hope to pick up the box copy down the road, or a loose box, or do you go for the complete? That causes prices to rise because a complete NES game, of course, is more than a loose NES game. Same thing with the Sega Saturn. A disc is not going to run you nearly as much as a complete in-box version. And that's what most people want. That's what most people want in their collection because they want the disc to remain safe. A disc is much more fragile than an old cartridge. I've broken many discs. I haven't broken many cartridges. So disc-based gaming, plus the fact that most people want these collected in boxes so that they can display them beautifully, is another reason why the Sega Saturn is so expensive to collect for. The final reason that the Sega Saturn is so expensive to collect for is actually an easy reason. You can play NES games, Super NES games, even PS1 and N64 games on pretty much any emulated device. You can play it on a computer, a cell phone, one of those Chinese knockoffs. It's super easy to emulate these systems. That's not the case with the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn is very difficult. It has very difficult architecture in order to program to get emulators running on. So even your high-end PCs are having trouble running some Sega Saturn games because it's so complex. That's why a lot of games didn't come out for the system as well, because developers were frustrated with how complex the architecture was, especially compared to the PlayStation 1 and the cartridges of the N64. So the Sega Saturn was at a disadvantage in that, and that makes it harder to collect for because people that want to play the games actually need to buy the games. And you see, that opens up a whole nother spectrum. That's why some of the best games on the Sega Saturn are also the most expensive games on the Sega Saturn. Games like Shining Force 3, Dragon Force, Burning Rangers, Panzer Dragoon Saga. These are all top tier games costing hundreds of dollars because they're some of the best games on the system. And if you want to play them, you actually need the discs. So that's where everything comes full circle. It's so hard to emulate the Sega Saturn that people don't even bother with it and they just want the actual games. So does that mean that the Sega Saturn isn't fun to collect for? No, I think it's actually the opposite, because most of the people that collect for the Sega Saturn actually collect because they want the games, not for an inflated ecosystem. With a system like the NES, you've got people selling Super Mario Bros. 3 for like 30 bucks, even though the game sold millions of copies. Whereas expensive games on the Saturn are actually expensive because they're rare. So if you find them out in the wild, if you find a good deal on them, you're actually finding a good deal. It's not some inflated, overinflated, ecosystem that's been created by gamers and resellers. So the Sega Saturn is a beautiful system. I love collecting for it. One of the games I picked up at Too Many Games was Alien Trilogy for the Sega Saturn, and I will continue to collect for the Sega Saturn. It's just going to be pricey probably. Let me know what you guys think of my analysis in the comment section below. Thank you for liking this video and thank you for subscribing, and I'll see you guys next time. Later.